Story 1: The Curse of Black Magic. John Harrison never believed in ghosts. As an investigative journalist, he thrived on exposing hoaxes and superstitions. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to uncover. It all started with a conversation at a dimly lit bar in New Orleans. The bartender, an old man with tired eyes, leaned in and whispered, "If you really want a story, there's a cabin deep in the Louisiana woods. People say it's cursed, that a black magician once lived there. No one who goes in ever comes back." John smirked. "That sounds like a good ghost story." The bartender didn't smile. "It's not a story, it's a warning." John dismissed the idea but couldn't shake the curiosity growing inside him. The next morning, he packed his camera and notebook and set off toward the forest. The road leading to the cabin was nearly impassable. Thick trees loomed on either side, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, only an eerie stillness. Finally, he arrived. The cabin stood alone, its wooden frame warped with age. Strange symbols were carved into the door, and a heavy air of decay hung around it. As John approached, an icy chill ran down his spine. It felt as if the forest itself was warning him to turn back. But he didn't. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight. Dust floated in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. Old furniture lay scattered, covered in thick layers of cobwebs. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with ancient books whose pages had turned brittle with time. As he moved deeper into the room, he noticed a single book resting on a wooden table. Unlike the others, this one looked untouched by time. He picked it up, feeling the strange texture of the leather cover. The title was written in a language he didn't recognize, but the moment his fingers traced the letters, a whisper echoed through the room. John spun around. The door had slammed shut. He rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The whispering grew louder, turning into a low, guttural voice. "You should not have come." A shadow flickered in the corner of the room. At first, it was barely noticeable, a disturbance in the dim light. But then it began to take shape, a tall figure shrouded in darkness with burning red eyes. John stumbled backward, his breath shallow. "Who's there?" The figure did not move. It simply stood, its presence suffocating, the air around it vibrating with unnatural energy. John forced himself to speak. "What are you?" The voice that answered was deep, layered, as if many voices were speaking at once. "A prisoner." John's heartbeat pounded in his ears. "Who imprisoned you?" The shadow shifted, its form flickering. "I did." John felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "Why?" The whispering returned, now surrounding him, filling the room with invisible movements. The walls pulsed as if alive. Then the figure stepped forward, and for the first time John saw its face, or what remained of it. It was human once. Now its skin was cracked like old parchment, its features distorted as if reality itself had twisted around it. Its eyes, black pits with glowing embers at the center, locked onto John's. "I was Lucian," it said, voice barely above a whisper. "A seeker of power, a fool." John swallowed hard. What happened? Lucian lifted a hand, and suddenly the room shifted. The walls melted into darkness, and John found himself standing in the same cabin, but it was no longer abandoned. A roaring fire blazed in the hearth, and a younger version of Lucian sat at a table, poring over a book, the same book John had picked up. John watched as Lucian spoke words from the book, his voice filled with desperation. The moment the final syllable left his lips, the fire turned black. The room shook and shadows erupted from the walls, wrapping around him like tendrils. He screamed, but there was no escape. The vision ended. John was back in the decayed version of the cabin, facing the cursed entity that Lucien had become. "I opened a door," Lucien said, "and something answered." John gritted his teeth. "How do I get out?" Lucien's gaze darkened. "You don't." The whispering turned into laughter, low, mocking, inhuman. The cabin groaned, its very foundation trembling. The shadows lengthened, stretching toward John. Desperation took over. He turned back to the book, flipping through the pages. His hands shook as he found the section that described a way to break the curse. There was an incantation, but it came with a warning. The one who speaks these words will take the burden upon themselves. John hesitated. The shadows crept closer. He had no choice. He took a deep breath and began reciting the words. The moment he started, the cabin convulsed. A deafening roar filled the air, and Lucien let out a scream, not of rage, but of relief. The darkness peeled away from him like smoke in the wind. His body dissolved, his essence pulled into the void. The cabin shuddered one last time, then fell silent. John collapsed, his vision fading. When he woke, he was outside. The sun was rising, casting golden light over the forest. The cabin was gone. Not destroyed, just gone, as if it had never existed. John staggered to his feet, his mind reeling. He had survived. But as he took his first step away from the clearing, he felt something shift inside him. A whisper echoed in his ears. "You took the burden upon yourself." John's breath hitched. His shadow flickered unnaturally. The curse hadn't been broken. It had been transferred, and now it belonged to him. Story 2. The Summoning. The storm raged over the Louisiana bayou, lightning flashing across the sky, illuminating the gnarled trees that loomed over the marsh. The rain fell in sheets, soaking the earth, turning the dirt road into a trail of thick, sucking mud. Ethan Carter gripped the wheel of his truck, his knuckles white. The directions he had received led him deep into the forest, far beyond any place he had ever been. He wasn't the kind of man who scared easily, but there was something about this place, something ancient, something wrong. He had been chasing stories of black magic for years, writing articles about old rituals and secret cults that practiced in the shadows of forgotten places. But this lead was different. The locals had spoken of a woman, Madame Rousseau, who lived alone in the depths of the swamp, performing rituals that no one dared to speak of. As he neared his destination, he saw it, a decrepit wooden house standing alone in the dark. The shutters hung loose, the porch sagged under the weight of time, and symbols were carved into the walls, barely visible in the dim light of his truck's headlights. Ethan hesitated before stepping out. The rain soaked him instantly, chilling him to the bone. He took a deep breath, walking up the creaking steps. He knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. He turned the handle. The door swung open with a long, agonizing creak. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of herbs, smoke, and something more metallic, something like blood. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long, dancing shadows. In the center of the room was a table covered in strange artifacts, bones, feathers, jars filled with dark, swirling liquid. And then he saw her. She sat in a wooden chair by the fireplace, her body still, her skin pale and wrinkled like old parchment. Her eyes, milky white, stared straight ahead. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't breathing. He took a step closer. And then, her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. He gasped, trying to pull away, but her grip was impossibly strong. Her head turned slowly, her lifeless eyes locking onto his. "You should not have come," she whispered. Ethan's blood turned to ice. I just wanted to ask." She cut him off, her voice hollow and cracked. "They are watching." A gust of wind blew through the house, though the windows were shut. The flames of the candles twisted unnaturally, stretching toward the ceiling as if something unseen had entered the room. Ethan felt it too, a presence, a darkness that pressed against his skin, crawling over him like unseen fingers. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Madame Rousseau's lips trembled. "I opened a door." A sound echoed through the room, a deep, guttural growl vibrating through the floorboards. Ethan turned. The shadows along the walls had grown, shifting unnaturally, taking shape. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in sharp points. Its face was hollow, a void of nothingness, yet he felt its gaze pierce through him. Madame Rousseau gasped. "It has come." Ethan stumbled backward, his heart hammering. "What is that?" Her grip on his wrist tightened. "It is the price." The air grew heavy. The walls groaned as if the house itself were alive. The thing in the shadows took another step forward, its presence radiating an unnatural cold that seeped into Ethan's bones. He turned to run, but the door was gone. The room had changed. The walls stretched into darkness, the ceiling disappeared, and the floor beneath him felt like shifting sand. The creature reached out. Ethan screamed. Then, darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was standing outside the house. The storm had stopped. The trees stood silent. The air was still. The house was gone. His truck was there, but it was covered in rust, vines crawling over it as if it had been sitting there for years. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. No signal. He checked his watch. It had stopped. Then he heard it. A whisper. He turned slowly. The shadow was still there, watching, waiting. Ethan wasn't free. He never would be. Story 3. The Mark of the Devil. The wind howled through the abandoned town of Black Hollow, a forgotten place hidden deep within the forests of Georgia. The town had been abandoned for nearly a century, ever since the night of the infamous ritual, the night when the people of Black Hollow vanished without a trace. For years it had remained untouched, a ghost town lost to time. But that didn't stop the rumors. People spoke of strange lights flickering in the windows of the old church, of voices whispering through the empty streets, of a presence watching from the shadows. It was exactly the kind of story that fascinated Daniel Graves. As a documentary filmmaker, he had spent years searching for real haunted places, real paranormal activity. Most of the time, he found nothing but crumbling buildings and overactive imaginations. But something about Black Hollow felt different. He had to see it for himself. Daniel arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ruins of the town. His camera gear was packed in the trunk, along with supplies for an overnight stay. He wanted to capture everything: the silence, the decay, the lingering presence of whatever had driven the townspeople away. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the dirt road. The air was thick, humid, and carried the scent of rain. The buildings stood like corpses, their skeletal remains covered in ivy and moss. At the center of the town was the old church. It was the only structure still mostly intact. Its windows were broken, its wooden doors weathered and cracked. Daniel felt drawn to it. He lifted his camera, recording as he approached. His footsteps echoed unnaturally in the stillness. When he reached the door, he hesitated. A symbol had been carved into the wood, an unfamiliar shape, jagged and intricate. It looked ancient, almost like a rune. He reached out, tracing the symbol with his fingertips. A sharp pain shot through his hand. He yanked it back, looking at his palm. A thin, red line had appeared across his skin, as if something had cut him. But there was nothing there, no nails, no splinters, just the symbol. Ignoring the unease creeping up his spine, he pushed open the doors. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The wooden pews were broken, some overturned. The altar stood at the far end, its once white cloth stained with something dark. The walls were covered in more of those strange symbols, drawn in deep, black strokes. Daniel turned on his camera light. The moment the beam illuminated the altar, the temperature in the room dropped. He exhaled, watching his breath form in the air. A whisper. Daniel froze. It had been faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it was there. He slowly turned, scanning the darkness. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Nothing. He took a step forward. The floor creaked beneath him, the sound unnaturally loud. He lifted his camera again, recording every inch of the room. When he turned the lens back toward the altar, he stopped breathing. There was something standing in the doorway. A tall, shadowy figure, motionless, watching. Daniel's grip tightened on the camera. He blinked, and it was gone. A chill crawled up his spine. He forced himself to breathe, convincing himself it was just his imagination. But then his camera screen flickered. The battery indicator dropped to 0, and the device shut off. Impossible. It had been fully charged. He turned to leave, but the moment he did, the doors slammed shut on their own. The whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding him. He spun around. The symbols on the walls were glowing, pulsing like they were alive. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He stumbled backward, hitting one of the pews. Then the voice came, deep, guttural. "You bear the mark." Daniel's blood ran cold. He looked down at his hand. The thin red cut had spread, forming into the same symbol carved into the church doors. The whispers turned to laughter. Something was in the room with him.